singing a song.
Red label, 80% proof.
I've been reading. Wall! There's a wall ahead!
Can you believe this, Jack?
After washing up on an eerie, uncharted island, a film crew shoot turns into a nightmare. Strange creatures roam the jungle, and their lead actress is taken by something far bigger than any man. Today we're revisiting the 2005 adventure epic King Kong. The story opens in 1933, with America still clawing its way back from the financial crash. In New York City, Indero is trying to survive however she can, performing when she's lucky, searching for work when she's not. The crowds that once filled theaters are disappearing, and the business is collapsing right along with them. Her friend Manny, who runs the show, finally admits what and already fears. There's no money left. He's closing up and leaving town, and is left staring down an uncertain future. Across the city, an ambitious director named Carl Denham is fighting his own battle. Only his isn't against poverty, but against rejection. He pitches investors on a bold new project, claiming he's found information about a remote island untouched by modern civilization. According to Carl, it's the perfect location for a sensational film. Wild, mysterious, and unlike anything audiences have ever seen. The investors step aside to talk, quickly deciding the whole idea is too risky and too expensive. Carl, however, overhears their decision before anyone can officially shut him down. Instead of arguing, he bolts, determined to move forward with or without permission. He orders his assistant Preston to gather the crew immediately. They're leaving within hours. There's only one major problem. His leading actress has backed out at the last second. Carl is racing against time when he notices, and on the street, something about her fits the image in his head. Exactly the kind of face he wants on camera. He pursues her, smooth talks his way into a conversation, and offers her the starring role over lunch. And refuses at first. She's wary of Carl's intensity and the vagueness of his promises. But her hesitation shifts when she hears one name, Jack Driscoll, a writer traveling with the team. That's enough to convince her to take a chance. Soon, the crew is hustling toward the docks. Preston warns Carl that the police are coming, likely to stop the voyage before it begins. With no time to waste, everyone scrambles aboard, and the ship pulls away just as authorities arrive, too late to do anything about it. Life on board quickly reveals the crew's rough and ready conditions. Space is limited, and Jack ends up sleeping near the cargo area, close to the cages used by Captain Engelhorn and his men, hunters who transport captured animals for profit. Another key passenger is Bruce Baxter, a confident actor who'll be playing Anne's romantic counterpart in Carl's film. While Jack works on his script, a young deckhand named Jimmy brings him food. Jimmy isn't just a crew member. He has a history with the ship, having once been discovered hiding aboard years earlier. Since then, he's become part of the floating family. The next day, it makes the rounds, meeting the team properly and finally coming face to face with Jack. As the trip continues, unease begins to creep in. One night, a crewman named Hayes approaches Carl and Preston with a chilling warning about their destination, Skull Island. He insists that going there is a death sentence, and that no one who steps onto that land returns the same, if they return at all. Carl dismisses him. To Carl, fear is just noise in the background. The movie matters more than caution, more than common sense, and, maybe, more than the safety of the people around him. Then the ocean changes. A heavy fog swallows the ship, leaving the crew blind in open water. Before anyone can react, the vessel collides with rock. Worse still, the captain realizes they're surrounded by jagged stone outcroppings. He fights the wheel, trying to thread through the maze, but the ship is battered again and again until it finally grinds to a halt. Panic spreads across the deck, except for Carl, who can barely hide his excitement. The chaos confirms what he's been hoping for all along. They've found Skull Island. The hull is damaged and leaking, and the crew begins patching the ship as best they can. Carl doesn't wait. With his camera team, he takes a smaller boat and heads toward shore, eager to capture the first images of the place that could make his career. When they land, the island greets them with a warning written in bone, skulls scattered like grim decorations. The air feels wrong, the silence too heavy, and the ground itself seems to dare them to keep walking. Carl, thrilled, records everything. And that's when their real nightmare begins. A film expedition drifts into the unknown and quickly turns into a fight for survival. Deep in the jungle, unnatural creatures prowl the shadows, and the team's leading lady is seized by a beast straight out of legend. We rewind to 1933, when America is still trying to stand back up after the market crash. In New York, Darrow is barely getting by, scraping together meals, chasing small gigs, and praying the next show draws a crowd. But the crowds aren't coming anymore. Theater seats are empty, money is drying up, and the world feels colder by the day. Her friend Manny, who runs the production, finally tells her what she's been dreading. The company is finished. He's out of options, out of cash, and he's leaving the city, and is left with one question. What happens to her now? Not far away, filmmaker Carl Denham is pushing a dream that no one wants to fund. He meets with investors and sells them on an outrageous pitch. He claims to have a lead on a remote island untouched by modern civilization, an isolated place where nature still rules like it did in ancient times. To Carl, it's the perfect set. It's dangerous, mysterious, and guaranteed to shock audiences. The investors step out to discuss it and quickly agree it's too expensive and too insane to back. But Carl catches their decision before they can deliver it officially. He doesn't negotiate, he escapes. If the studio won't support him, he'll do it anyway. He grabs his assistant, Preston, and orders him to pull the crew together immediately. No dilas. They're sailing within hours. Then another crisis hits. The original lead actress disappears from the project at the worst possible moment. Carl needs a replacement now. That's when he spots, and on the street, someone with the exact look he imagines on the poster. He follows her, corners a conversation, and invites her to lunch, pitching the role with the kind of confidence that's hard to ignore, and initially refuses. Carl's promises are big, but vague, and his energy feels reckless. But when she learns that Jack Driscoll, a writer traveling with the production, is involved, she hesitates and then agrees to take the job. Soon the whole group is sprinting for the docks. Preston warns Carl that the police are on their way, likely to shut the whole operation down before it can leave port. The crew rushes aboard, the ship pulls out, and by the time the authorities arrive, the water has already swallowed the distance between them. Once they're at sea, reality sets in. The ship is cramped, rough, and clearly not designed for comfort. With limited space, Jack is forced to sleep near the cargo, right by the cages used by Captain Engelhorn and his men, who make their living capturing animals on distant voyages. Another important passenger is Bruce Baxter, the self-assured actor cast opposite and in Carl's film. As Jack keeps working on his script, a young deckhand named Jimmy brings him dinner. Jimmy isn't just another sailor. Years ago, he was discovered hiding on this very ship, and he stayed ever since, becoming part of the crew's everyday life. The next morning, and meets the rest of the team properly, and finally comes face-to-face with Jack. But as the days pass, a strange tension builds. One night, a crewman named Hayes pulls Carl and Preston aside and issues a serious warning about their destination, Skull Island. He swears that going there is a one-way trip, that people who step onto that land don't come back. Not whole, and sometimes not at all. Carl brushes him off. To him, fear is just background noise. The film comes first, above risk, above reason, and maybe even above the lives around him. Then the sea turns hostile. A thick fog wraps around the ship, killing visibility. Before the crew can orient themselves, the vessel slams into rock. The captain realizes too late they've drifted into a field of jagged stone outcroppings. He wrestles the wheel, trying to navigate through it, but the ship takes hit after hit until it finally grinds to a stop. Panic erupts on deck, everyone except Carl, who looks almost satisfied. The disaster confirms what he's been hoping for. They've reached Skull Island. With the hull damaged and water seeping in, the sailors begin emergency repairs. Carl doesn't wait around. He takes a smaller boat and rows toward shore with his camera crew, determined to capture proof of this place before anyone can stop him. The island welcomes them with a message made of bone, skulls scattered across the ground, like a warning sign no one can ignore. The air feels heavy, the silence unnatural, and the land itself seems to threaten them with every step forward. Carl, however, is thrilled. He keeps filming, and that's the moment the nightmare truly starts. Out in the jungle, the separated crew pushes deeper into the trees, try to regroup, and find a way back. The terrain narrows into a rocky passage that opens near a cave, and the moment they get close, they realize they aren't alone. Something huge is breathing in the dark. Hayes immediately senses the danger. He orders the others to run while he stays behind to buy them time. It's brave and tragic. Within moments, the monster reveals itself, Kong. Hayes is seized like a toy and hurled from the heights, vanishing into the abyss below. The crew freezes in shock. Jimmy, especially, is wrecked. Hayes wasn't just a teammate, he was the closest thing he had to family. The men scramble to fight back, firing wildly while Carl, still obsessed, keeps filming the horror as if it's all part of the production. The battle spirals into chaos when Kong begins swinging a massive log across the canyon like a wrecking bar. In the turmoil, Carl loses his camera and barely manages to cling to branches as the log smashes through the gap and tumbles into the ravine. Elsewhere, and is racing through the forest searching for the others when she stumbles onto something nauseating, a giant reptile tearing into a fresh carcass. She tries to stay silent, backing away into the trees, but the predator spots her. She bolts and wedges herself into the twisted roots of a massive tree, hoping the creature can't reach her. But it keeps clawing, snapping, and forcing its way in. She's second from being swallowed when the predator is suddenly yanked backward and ripped apart by something even stronger, and barely has time to breathe before the ground seems to come alive. Massive insects, centipede-like nightmares, swarm toward her, and she flees again, stumbling out into an even worse situation. A T-Rex charges. Even with prey already in its jaws, it turns its attention to, and as if she's the real prize. She tries to blend into the leaves, praying it loses sight of her, only to realize another hunter is right beside her, ready to strike. At the last instant, Kong storms in. He slams into the dinosaur with raw force, and for a heartbeat, it looks like the fight is over, until another Tyrannosaurus crashes into the brawl and clamps down on Kong's arm. Then a third joins the assault, turning it into a savage 3-on-1. Kong fights like a titan, throwing blow after blow, keeping the dinosaurs away from and even as they surround him. The struggle spills toward a cliff edge. One by one, Kong knocks the predators over, only to be dragged with them as the ground gives way, and is separated in the fall, snagged by hanging roots high above a swampy drop. A dinosaur scrambles nearby, snapping at her, determined to finish the job. Kong hauls himself up the rock face with terrifying speed, reaching her just in time to drive the monster back. But the danger doesn't stop. Another Rex lunges and slips into its grasp, and the roots finally tear loose. The creature plunges into the swamp below, taking the immediate threat with it, and can't run. She's trapped. Kong arrives again, furious, protective, unstoppable. He charges the last giant reptile and ends it in brutal fashion, wrenching its jaw apart and dropping it like it weighs nothing. Then he roars across the jungle, a victory cry that makes it clear why the island fears him. For the moment, and is safe. And instead of fleeing, she chooses to stay close, moving with Kong as he heads deeper across Skull Island, almost as if she senses he's the only thing standing between her and the island's hunger. Back at the crash site, Jack regains consciousness and finds the few survivors still breathing. Night is falling fast, and with the darkness comes something worse than dinosaurs. Swarms of enormous insects crawling in from every direction. The group is overwhelmed. One of the men is dragged down and killed in a horrifying way as the swarm covers him. Jimmy grabs a gun and starts firing, trying to hold them off, but it's pointless. Every time one drops, another takes its place. The survivors are moments from being swallowed alive when Captain Engelhorn and more crew members arrive, creating a distraction long enough for the others to escape. After everything they've lost, most of the crew wants one thing: back to the ship, back to the ocean, back home. But Jack refuses to quit, and is still out there. Carl, meanwhile, shifts gears, because to him, the nightmare is also an opportunity. He convinces the captain to consider a new plan. Instead of running, they could capture Kong. On the ship, there are sedatives stored in bottles. Enough, Carl believes, to bring the giant down long enough to transport him to New York and turn him into the greatest discovery the modern world has ever seen. While that plan quietly forms, Jack moves ahead alone, sneaking beneath a massive bat-filled area as he climbs toward Kong's lair. At the top, he sees and, alive, resting in Kong's grip as the beast sleeps, and tries to carefully slip free without waking him. But Kong stirs and spots Jack. Instantly, Kong explodes into rage and attacks. The commotion panics the giant bats overhead, and the swarm dives into the fight, forcing Kong to defend himself on multiple fronts. In the confusion, Jack and escape. Jack grabs a vine and swings down the mountainside, but Kong catches them and yanks them back up like they're weightless. Thinking fast, Jack clings to one of the bats and uses it to glide away, pulling and with him. Kong isn't letting her go. He charges after them through the jungle, tearing through obstacles with pure fury. When Jack and reach the extraction point, Jack shouts for Carl to lower the bridge. But Carl hesitates, waiting, because he doesn't want the bridge lowered until Kong is close enough for his plan to work. Carl stalls at the bridge, waiting for Kong to get close enough to spring the trap. But Preston can't stomach it. He makes a split-second choice, ignores Carl's plan, and cuts the rope, dropping the bridge so Jack and can get across and reunite with the others. The relief doesn't last. Once and is back with the crew, she quickly senses something is wrong. Their eyes aren't on the escape route. They're on the jungle behind her. And when Kong bursts into view, charging toward them to take her back, the truth becomes undeniable. They're not trying to survive the island anymore. They're trying to claim a prize. The trap snaps shut. Nets fly. Men swarm. Kong is hit, tangled, and overwhelmed. Jack and shout for them to stop, but the decision has already been made. When Jack realizes he can't change their minds, he drags in toward the shore, desperate to get her away before the situation turns even uglier. Kong refuses to stay down. With a surge of strength, he tears through the netting and storms after them, thundering across the sand as the crew scrambles into boats. Captain Engelhorn hurls a harpoon to slow him, and Carl follows with something far worse, a bottle of sedative thrown straight into Kong's face. The giant staggers. His fight drains out of him. And, watching him collapse, can't hide what's flooding her expression. It isn't fear anymore. It's grief. Weeks later, New York is roaring with excitement. Broadway posters announce a spectacle unlike anything the city has ever seen. King Kong, the eighth wonder of the world. Lines stretch down the street. People fight for tickets. Carl has turned the island into a headline and turned Kong into a product. The show is a financial explosion, a triumph that makes Carl richer than he ever imagined. Jack sits in the crowd, but he isn't celebrating. He looks haunted since returning from the island and has kept her distance, furious and heartbroken over what happened and unable to forgive the part Jack played in bringing her home at Kong's expense. Carl steps onto the stage like a conquering hero. He tells the audience they're about to witness the journey that cost him 17 men, framing the spectacle as a tribute, something the world deserves to see. Then the curtain lifts. Kong stands chained beneath the lights. The same creature who ruled an untamed world now looks drained and defeated, forced into stillness by iron and pain. He's no longer a king. He's a prop. Carl continues the performance, even introducing Bruce Baxter as the brave hero of the expedition. Dancers reenact the island's rituals. The crowd eats it up. And then comes the final act, the stage sacrifice, where is presented to the beast. But Jack immediately realizes something is off. That isn't Anne. Preston leans in and confirms it, and refused to take part. She walked away from the money and the spotlight. She wanted nothing to do with this humiliation. When Kong sees the woman on stage, he reacts at first, then realizes the truth. It's not her. The recognition twists into rage. Cameras flash. Photographers surge forward, and the chaos only pushes him further. At first, the audience thinks it's part of the show, an incredible performance, too real to be fake. Then the chains start snapping, and the theater turns into a stampede. Kong breaks free, grabs the actress who was used as bait, and throws her aside as if she's nothing. People scream and scatter. He lunges after Jack, and Jack bolts through the panic, weaving through bodies and debris as the giant thunders behind him. Outside, the city becomes a playground of terror. Cars flip, crowds scatter, streetlights shake. Kong moves with one purpose: find Anne. And because he only remembers one detail clearly, her hair, he begins grabbing every blonde woman he sees, holding them up, searching their faces, and discarding them when they're not the one. When, and here's what's happening, she runs toward the commotion. Jack, meanwhile, tries to pull Kong away from the city, using a car and his own life as bait to draw the creature into pursuit. Kong takes it. He chases Jack through the streets, closing distance with every crashing step until he finally corners him. One blow sends Jack down, but instead of finishing him, Kong hesitates because he senses something. He turns and sees an approaching. The rage melts into something quieter. Kong gathers and carefully, almost gently, and walks with her through streets that have emptied in fear until they reach a frozen lake. Under the night sky, the chaos fades. For one brief moment, the city feels still. Kong and move together across the ice. An eerie, tender pause in the middle of disaster, like the world has stopped holding its breath. Then the gunfire starts. Kong joute, instant screaming danger. He flees, climbing higher and higher to escape the hunters, until he reaches the top of the Empire State Building, where he finally pauses with, and holding her close as if the height can protect them. It can't. Warplanes roar in. Bullets rip the air. Kong rises to meet them, climbing to the highest point to pull the attackers away from Anne. But Anne refuses to run. She follows, desperate not to leave him alone. Jack forces his way into the building, fighting through guards and chaos to reach the top, and climbs the stairs, pushing herself through panic and exhaustion, until she slips and nearly falls to her death. Kong catches her just in time and lowers her safely inside. Outside, the planes keep coming. Kong is hit again and again. He still swings at the aircraft, still fights with everything he has, but it's obvious now he can't win, and stays with him to the last second, pleading, refusing to abandon him, even managing, for a moment, to make the pilots hesitate. But the damage is already done. Kong is failing. He looks at Anne one last time, an exhausted farewell without words, then loosens his grip on the fight. His strength finally gives out, and he falls from the skyscraper, crashing into the city below. Jack reaches in the aftermath, and she runs into his arms, shaking, devastated, alive. Below, the streets fill with people drawn to the spectacle. They crowd around Kong's lifeless body, shouting, snapping photos, treating the tragedy like an event. Carl stands there staring at the wreckage of his masterpiece, and the realization finally lands: this wasn't victory. Kong wasn't defeated by technology or bullets. In the end, it was love and what the world did to it that brought the king down. Analysis. In the early years of cinema, monsters weren't just creatures. They were mirrors. They reflected fear, desire, curiosity, the human need to conquer what we don't understand, and to turn the unknown into something we can sell. And in 2005, director Peter Jackson brought one of the most famous monsters in film history back to the screen, not as a simple spectacle, but as a tragedy. This is King Kong, a 3-hour epic that blends old Hollywood romance, survival horror, and big-budget adventure, while quietly asking a disturbing question. When we say we love something, do we mean we love it, or do we mean we want to own it? Tonight, we're taking a full documentary-style journey through King Kong, 2005. How it was made, what it's actually saying beneath the noise and the roar, why it remains controversial, and why, for many viewers, it has only grown more powerful with time. Because this isn't just the story of a monster who falls from the sky. It's the story of how people built the cage long before the chains ever appeared. And it begins in a city where dreams are cheap and survival costs everything. King Kong was released in 2005, directed by Peter Jackson, and written by Jackson alongside Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, the same creative trio behind The Lord of the Rings. It's an adventure film, a romance, a period drama, and a monster movie, crafted with the emotional ambition of a prestige epic and the kinetic energy of a blockbuster. The runtime sits just over 3 hours, and that alone shaped its reputation. Some saw it as indulgent. Others saw it as necessary, because Jackson wasn't trying to make a quick thrill ride. He was trying to make you mourn. The film was produced through a collaboration between American studios and Jackson's New Zealand-based production machine, combining massive sets, practical filmmaking techniques, and cutting-edge visual effects, especially in the creation of Kong himself. But to understand what King Kong 2005 is, we have to understand what it was trying to resurrect. Not just a character, a feeling. The film opens in 1933 during the Great Depression. New York is cold, crowded, and unforgiving. People are hungry, not just for food, but for opportunity. In this world, we meet Darrow, a performer scraping by in a city that offers little mercy. Her talent is real, but talent doesn't pay rent. We also meet Carl Denham, a filmmaker with a hunger that goes beyond art. He wants to make something unforgettable, something that will force the world to look at him. When Denham assembles a film crew and sets sail for a mysterious, uncharted island, the mission is presented as filmmaking. But beneath that, it's something older. Exploration. Extraction. The island they discover is more than a location. It's a world cut off from time, dense, ancient, and hostile. A place where nature isn't scenery. Nature is an active threat. And at the center of this world stands Kong. A creature treated like a god by some, a nightmare by others, and, slowly, increasingly, a living being the audience is asked to understand rather than defeat. What follows is a journey that begins as adventure, becomes survival, and ends as something closer to tragedy. The film doesn't ask, can they escape? It asks, what will they take with them, and what will they destroy in the process? Darrow is the film's emotional anchor. She begins as a woman surviving day to day, resourceful, exhausted, and cautious. But she carries something rare, empathy, not naive optimism, but a real ability to see pain in others. Carl Denham is the engine of the plot. He is not a classic villain. He's more dangerous than that. He's charismatic, persuasive, the kind of person who can turn exploitation into a dream and sell it as destiny. Denham believes in spectacle, and he believes that if something is beautiful, if something is extraordinary, then it deserves to be shown, no matter what it costs. Jack Driscoll, the writer, represents a quieter perspective. He's principled and skeptical, the type of man who sees the warning signs early but struggles to stop the momentum once it's moving. And then there is Kong. Kong is not treated as a simple monster. He is filmed like a character. He has reactions, moods, curiosity, and pain. The bond between Kong and becomes the emotional spine of the story, not as a conventional romance, but as recognition. Two beings from different worlds, caught inside someone else's ambition. In many ways, Kong is the film's purest character, because he is the only one who never pretends. Under its spectacle, King Kong 2005 is a film about possession, about the human impulse to claim what we don't understand. The island represents an untouched world, one that exists outside modern control. And the moment outsiders arrive, that world becomes a resource, a backdrop, a prize. Kong represents nature, yes, but also the other, the misunderstood, the exoticized, the being reduced to myth so people don't have to face the reality of its suffering, and represents empathy, the one person who looks past fear and sees a living presence. And Denham represents a disturbing truth. Exploitation often wears the face of passion. The famous line, "It was beauty killed the beast," becomes more complex here. Because in Jackson's version, it isn't beauty itself that kills. It's what people do in the name of beauty. The film also speaks directly to cinema. Denham is a filmmaker, and his camera is a weapon as much as it is an instrument of art. This is a movie about movies, about the way audiences demand spectacle, and how the spectacle always comes from somewhere. Something is always paying the price. Peter Jackson directs King Kong like a man returning to the film that made him love filmmaking in the first place. This isn't a cold remake. It's emotional, nostalgic, sometimes excessive. Jackson's pacing is deliberate. He lingers on faces, on reactions, on atmosphere. He builds tension slowly, then releases it in long, chaotic bursts. This style divides audiences. Some viewers feel the film takes too long to get where it's going. Others argue that the time is the point because the story is about obsession, and obsession doesn't move quickly. It circles. It fixates. It refuses to let go. In that way, the film's structure becomes a reflection of its theme. The visuals of King Kong, 2005, operate in two distinct worlds. Skull Island is shot like a nightmare. The frame is crowded, the environment feels wet and alive, and the camera often moves like something stalking the characters. New York, by contrast, is geometric and cold. The city is a machine, built of steel, stone, and human ambition. The color grading reflects this divide. The island leans into earthy, decaying greens and browns. The city leans into gray-blue tones that make even daylight feel harsh. And at the center of it all is Kong, created through motion capture, visual effects, and meticulous physicality. His eyes are not just animated. They are performed. The film constantly uses scale to tell story. Humans are framed as small, fragile, temporary. Kong is framed as massive, powerful, and increasingly vulnerable. The score, composed by James Newton Howard, carries a sweeping emotional weight. It doesn't treat the story like a monster movie. It treats it like a tragedy. The music often leans into melancholy rather than triumph. Even action sequences feel haunted by a sense of inevitability. Sound design plays a crucial role in Kong's realism. Every breath, footstep, and rumble sells mass and presence. But just as important is the use of quiet. Some of the film's most intimate moments are nearly silent, allowing the environment, the wind, and the space between characters to do the speaking. It's a technique that gives the story dignity. It lets emotion land without forcing it. Naomi Watts delivers the kind of performance that makes the impossible feel real. Acting opposite a creature that doesn't physically exist on set requires precision and imagination, and she grounds and in something believable. Jack Black plays Denham with unsettling warmth. He's funny, passionate, desperate, and that's what makes him frightening. Because people like Denham don't see themselves as villains. Adrien Brody brings sincerity and restraint, balancing the film's emotional chaos with something calm and human. And Andy Serkis, through performance capture, gives Kong a soul. The way Kong tilts his head, pauses, reacts to small movements, it's character acting expressed through physicality. This is not just visual effects. This is performance translated into digital form. The editing of King Kong, 2005, is built for immersion, not speed. The film is structured almost like a classic epic, a long setup, an extended journey, and a final act that shifts tone completely. Some sequences are intentionally prolonged, especially action scenes, creating exhaustion and intensity. But the quieter scenes also breathe, giving emotional moments time to settle. The runtime is part of the experience. Whether that works for you depends on what you want from the film. A thrill ride? Or a slow descent into tragedy? The original King Kong, 1933, was one of the most influential films ever made, shaping the monster genre and early blockbuster storytelling. Peter Jackson has openly treated the 2005 version as a tribute, an attempt to recreate the awe he felt as a child watching the original. But the cultural context changed. In 1933, Kong was largely spectacle. In 2005, audiences demanded emotional realism. Visual effects had evolved. Storytelling had evolved. Jackson's film sits at the intersection of nostalgia and modern blockbuster expectations, trying to honor the past while also deepening it. That ambition is why the film is remembered, and why it's debated. There are multiple ways to interpret King Kong, 2005, and the film invites them. One reading sees Kong as a symbol of nature punished for existing outside human control. Another sees Kong as a symbol of the other, the outsider turned into entertainment, stripped of dignity and punished for being misunderstood, and can be read as compassion caught inside a system built on spectacle. Someone who forms a genuine bond with Kong, but cannot save him from the world that wants to own him. Carl Denham can be read as the embodiment of exploitative ambition, not just in filmmaking, but in capitalism itself. The hunger to turn life into profit. And the ending, without detailing specifics, functions less like a conclusion and more like a statement. When you bring something pure into a world built on control, the world will not adapt. It'll destroy it. When King Kong, 2005, released, responses were intense. Many praised its emotional weight and visual effects. Others criticized its length and tonal shifts. The film earned major recognition for its technical achievements, and its depiction of Kong became a milestone in motion capture performance and creature animation. Over time, the film's reputation has evolved. As blockbuster cinema became faster, louder, and more formulaic, Jackson's version began to look unusual, almost old-fashioned, in its sincerity. It's a movie that risks being heartfelt, and that risk is why it still matters. The film's greatest strength is emotional ambition. It wants you to feel tragedy in a genre that often avoids it. Its craftsmanship is extraordinary. Visual effects, production design, sound, and performance capture work together to create a creature who feels alive. Its main weakness is pacing. Some sections are undeniably stretched, and certain sequences push beyond tension into endurance. But even that weakness comes from the same source as its strengths. This is a film made by someone who didn't want to make a clean movie. He wanted to make an overwhelming one. King Kong, 2005, is not a perfect remake. It is something stranger. It is a blockbuster tragedy, a romance between worlds, a cinematic confession about obsession, about the danger of turning wonder into possession. My rating remains 8.5 out of 10. If you want a tight, efficient monster movie, this may test your patience. But if you want a film that treats its monster like a character, that builds spectacle not just to amaze you, but to break your heart, then King Kong, 2005, is absolutely worth the journey. Because by the time the final moments arrive, what hurts isn't what happens. What hurts is realizing it was always going to happen, and the world was cheering the whole time. Reviews. I get why some people say the 2005 King Kong can't touch the 1933 classic, but I still think Peter Jackson's version is a really strong ride. The opening stretch gets labeled too slow, a lot, yet it worked for me because the film looks incredible. The cinematography is so rich and atmospheric that it keeps you engaged even before the big attractions arrive. Naomi Watts is easily one of the movie's biggest wins. As in Darrow, she brings warmth and old Hollywood sparkle, and she sells the emotional moments with Kong in a way that makes the fantasy feel grounded. That's not easy when you're acting opposite a digital character for so much of the runtime, but she pulls it off with total commitment. Kong himself takes a while to show up, but once he does, the payoff is worth it. The design is seamless, expressive, believable, and oddly human in his reactions without turning him into a cartoon. A lot of that comes down to the performance work behind the effects, and Andy Serkis deserves major credit for giving Kong personality and physical presence. It's one of those cases where the technology impresses, but the performance is what makes it stick. The supporting cast is more uneven. Jack Black is a strange fit as filmmaker Carl Denham, and at times he leans into a broader, showier style than the rest of the movie. Still, he's not a deal-breaker. He brings energy, and his character's ambition and opportunism are easy to believe even when he's not especially likable. Adrien Brody, though, was the one performance that didn't quite land for me. His Jack Driscoll feels a bit too timid and soft around the edges, especially when the story seems to want a sturdier leading man presence. Where the film really goes all in is Skull Island, and that's both its strength and its biggest problem. The production design is insanely detailed, and Jackson directs the chaos with confidence. Everything feels huge, dangerous, and carefully constructed. But some of the creature material is so intense, it stops being fun monster movie and starts drifting into full-on nightmare fuel. A few sequences are genuinely unpleasant, and not in a thrilling way. More like the movie is daring you to keep watching. The insect-heavy moments and the nastier things swallowing people imagery are the clearest examples. And there are also parts involving the island's native tribe that feel uncomfortable rather than adventurous. That said, when the action hits the right note, it's spectacular. The stampede sequence is a standout. Massive scale, real weight to the movement, and a sense that the environment itself is collapsing under the force of what's happening. It's the kind of set piece that's pure cinema. My other complaint is that the movie sometimes confuses bigger with better. At over 3 hours, it's undeniably ambitious, and the 1933 New York setting is a great choice. The Depression-era texture, makeshift camps, struggling performers, and a city that feels worn down adds a lot of flavor and helps the story feel like a period adventure instead of a modern action remake. But the film lingers too long on certain Skull Island horrors, and trimming that section would have helped the pacing and kept the tone from tipping into excess. Once the story returns to Manhattan, it finds its rhythm again. The spectacle is grand, but there's also a tragic undercurrent that makes the final act hit harder. Even some darkly comic moments, like Kong snatching the wrong women and tossing them aside, underline how chaotic and out of control the situation has become. In the end, I'd call Jackson's King Kong a flawed, but mesmerizing remake. Technically brilliant, often beautiful, occasionally disturbing, and carried by a fantastic lead performance from Naomi, Watts plus an impressively realized Kong. It may not outshine the original, but at its best, it earns its place beside it. Peter Jackson taking the reins of King Kong feels like a full-circle moment. He's been open about how the 1933 original helped spark his love of filmmaking, and you can sense that mix of reverence and ambition throughout this gigantic remake. And honestly, even though Kong has been revisited 1,000 times, some entries memorable, others not so much, Jackson's version arrives with the confidence of a director coming off a career-defining triumph. The opening stretch is one of the film's strongest assets. It doesn't rush into spectacle. Instead, it patiently sets up a vivid snapshot of Depression-era America, with the mood shaped by financial hardship and the cultural shadow of Prohibition. The dialogue has bite, the humor lands naturally, and the filmmaking is slick without feeling artificial. Visually, it's stunning. There's a grand, cinematic polish to the camera work and overall style that keeps you locked in even before the adventure truly begins. Jackson also puts real effort into making the characters feel defined early. So when the expedition finally heads toward Skull Island, you already understand the group dynamics and each person's role in the chaos ahead. The performances are consistently strong. Adrien Brody brings an earnest, grounded energy as the romantic lead, and his presence works well against the film's larger-than-life elements. Jack Black, too, is surprisingly effective, charming enough to stay watchable, but clearly positioned as the story's real human danger. Naomi Watts has a tough job stepping into a role that carries a lot of legacy. She occasionally pushes a bit hard emotionally, but she's still compelling, especially once the bond with Kong takes center stage. The supporting players add a lot of texture. There's a steady reliability in the crew, memorable character beats across the board, and Andy Serkis is an absolute standout. Again, injecting personality into every scene he touches. Once the film shifts into its long jungle survival stretch, the pacing starts to wobble. There's no denying the craft and imagination on display, but it sometimes feels like the movie gets distracted by its own toy box. The action can become repetitive, and sequences that should feel thrilling begin to stretch a bit too far, particularly when the monster set pieces keep escalating without enough emotional forward momentum. That said, Skull Island isn't lacking in intensity. The horror edge is surprisingly sharp. The island's inhabitants are unsettling. The violence can be abrupt and brutal, and Jackson clearly isn't afraid to lean into discomfort. One sequence in particular, the insect and creature nightmare, delivers pure, grotesque survival terror, the kind that's hard to forget even if you want to. It's nasty, inventive, and extremely effective at making the audience squirm. The final act brings the story back to New York, and into more familiar King Kong territory. The tragic spectacle of a captured creature turned into entertainment, followed by a destructive outburst that feels inevitable. The big city rampage is technically impressive and often thrilling, though a couple of sentimental moments lean a little too far into softness and could have been trimmed. Still, the effects work is strong enough that the destruction feels weighty and real, and the film does a great job making Kong feel like a living being rather than just a digital creation. Where the movie truly shines is in the quieter, emotional center, especially in the scenes between Kong and Anne. Their connection is the heart of the film, and the tenderness that grows between them gives meaning to the spectacle. She isn't just a bystander to the myth. She's the one person who reaches him, calms him, and understands what he is beyond the fear and legend. Those moments are surprisingly moving, and they're what elevate the movie from impressive blockbuster into something more memorable. There are small changes that could have pushed this into masterpiece territory for me. If certain extended creature sequences, particularly the nastiest ones, had been shortened, and if the runtime had been tightened, I'd be very close to calling it perfect. Even so, the production design alone is extraordinary. The film's version of New York feels like a time machine. You can almost feel the era, the struggle, and the atmosphere of a city living through one of its bleakest economic chapters. That level of detail is rare, and it adds a layer of authenticity that many effects-heavy films never achieve. Overall, it's an epic that sometimes overindulges, but when it hits, it really hits. Gorgeous filmmaking, strong performances, a surprisingly harsh streak of horror, and an emotional core that makes Kong's tragedy land the way it should. Peter Jackson going big isn't exactly a surprise, but with King Kong, he doesn't just go big, he goes maximum. And on a pure spectacle level, it's hard not to respect the ambition. The movie looks incredible, sounds incredible, and when it's firing on all cylinders, it's honestly thrilling. That said, the one issue you can't ignore is the runtime. This film feels like it's carrying an extra 30 to 60 minutes it didn't need. If it had been trimmed down, it could have been tighter, sharper, and more intense. Instead, some sections drag, the pacing gets wobbly, and a few sequences tip over into territory that feels more like a Jurassic Park sequel than a King Kong story. There's a certain kind of over-the-top action here that becomes less exciting and more exhausting. The dino chaos, the endless close calls, the relentless creature attacks. It's impressive, sure, but it goes on too long. At some point, you stop feeling suspense and start feeling fatigue. And then there are moments that are so cheesy, they almost feel like they belong in a different movie. Some of the look what we can do monster set pieces are impressive as visual effects, but tonally they can be awkward, like the film is trying so hard to top itself that it forgets what makes Kong work in the first place. Still, when Kong is on screen, the movie becomes something else. The effects work on Kong is genuinely remarkable. He doesn't just look like a giant CGI character. He's animated and framed in a way that makes him feel like a living creature with weight, emotion, and personality. That's one of the biggest upgrades from earlier versions. Kong feels less like a movie monster and more like an actual animal. And because of that, the story hits differently. You're constantly aware that he's not a villain. He's a creature pulled into a situation he can't possibly survive. The film also keeps the emotional backbone, the Beauty and the Beast dynamic, the obsession of the filmmaker chasing greatness, and that whole last chance desperation behind the expedition. In theory, that's all strong material. In practice, the romance angle is where the movie can get divisive. Some people will buy into the connection between Kong and Darrow, but there are scenes that can feel like the film is forcing the sentiment. A couple of moments are so drawn out and sweet that they risk turning powerful emotion into eye-rolling melodrama. There's even a sequence that plays almost like a cute date montage, and depending on your tolerance, it might be charming or it might make you want to shout at the screen. The cast is another mixed bag. Naomi Watts is easily the strongest fit. She sells the character well and carries the emotional side of the story better than the film sometimes deserves. But other casting choices feel questionable. Jack Black's big, ambitious director performance can come off mismatched, and Adrien Brody's role doesn't always click as the romantic lead. When your film is asking the audience to stay locked in for over 3 hours, you really need the human characters to be just as compelling as the spectacle, and that's not always the case here. Then there's a practical story question the movie doesn't exactly make easier to ignore. How did they even transport Kong to New York in the first place? What was the plan? Did they have a real method, a backup plan, a crew that understood what they were doing? You can hand-wave it as movie logic, and it's not the biggest deal, but it's one of those little things that sticks in your head. And yet, for all the criticism, it's hard to deny what this film accomplishes. When a movie works, it's grand, emotional, and packed with unforgettable imagery. The New York sections are iconic, and the finale has that tragic inevitability that defines the best versions of the story. You might not even feel sad in the traditional way. You might just feel tense or distracted by the sheer fear of heights, or focused on and trying to get to safety. But either way, the ending lands with weight because you know there was never going to be a happy outcome for Kong. So where does that leave it? If you're a fan of modern blockbuster filmmaking and you want a huge effects-driven adventure, this delivers. Younger audiences especially will probably love it. But if you're comparing it to the 1933 original, it's tough because even though the remake is technically superior, it doesn't always have the same charm or tight storytelling. The original still feels like the purest version of the idea. Overall, I'd say Peter Jackson's King Kong is a near-great remake that's held back by one major flaw. It tries to do too much for too long. Cut it down, sharpen the pacing, and remove a few overextended action stretches, and you'd have something close to classic status. As it stands, a big, bold, visually stunning film. Messy in parts, amazing in others, and still absolutely worth seeing. For me, this is the director at his absolute best. Honestly, I went in expecting a lot less, especially since it's a remake. And yes, the CGI is a huge reason it works, but visual effects alone don't magically fix weak direction, flat acting, or sloppy writing. The surprise here is that it doesn't need excuses. The pacing, the tension, the scale, everything clicks. It's thrilling, consistently engaging, and somehow still feels fresh. What really gets me is how it holds up over time. I've rewatched it 3 times across the last 15 years, and it still hits me with the same sense of wonder. I'm basically a kid again, just a kid who's almost 60. There's something about that old Hollywood spirit blended with modern filmmaking that keeps pulling me back in. And there's also a personal, emotional layer that sneaks up on me. Naomi Watts meeting Fay Wray, the face of the 1933 original, and actually forming a friendship with her. Just thinking about it can make my throat tighten. It's like cinema reaching across generations. It reminds me of those rare moments where icons meet their successors, like Jessica Chastain and Maureen O'Hara crossing paths not long before O'Hara passed in 2015. 2 famously red-haired stars from very different eras sharing the same space. Briefly. Story-wise, we're dropped into 1930s New York, and we follow 2 people who are cornered by life in different ways. Carl Denham is a driven filmmaker with a big vision, but no backing. Studios won't take the gamble. And Darrow is a performer who's fallen on hard times, close to starving, and one step away from being pushed into work she never wanted. Denham, desperate to get his project off the ground, spots her at the right moment. He sells her on a mysterious trip to shoot on a remote island, helped by the presence of writer Jack Driscoll. And once the ship reaches its destination, calling it a difficult production is putting it mildly. I actually first watched this version during a long airport delay, 12 hours of waiting before a transatlantic flight. First class, in that moment, mostly meant paying extra to be treated with basically the same indifference as everyone else. At least I had my laptop with me and a DVD to kill time. Sure, a movie like this loses something when you're not seeing it on a huge screen, but even in a smaller format, it still delivered what it was built to deliver: a loud, glossy, expensive monster adventure. You can tell the director also wanted more than that, though. There's an attempt to make the story deeper, to pull genuine tragedy and tenderness out of the legend. Sometimes it almost gets there. But for me, it doesn't fully land. Most people are here for the spectacle, and the film seems to know that, because once it stops setting pieces up and finally lets loose, the action is intense, polished, chaotic in a fun way, and visually jaw-dropping. My one big issue is that underneath the noise and beauty, it can feel emotionally thin. The movie tries hard to sell a gentle bond between Kong and, but often comes across as manufactured rather than earned. Instead of moments that build intimacy, we get a lot of lingering close-ups and symbolic pauses, meaningful stares that suggest depth more than they actually created. I get what the film is aiming for, and I respect the ambition, but I personally don't connect with the idea that this relationship is some profound love story. I never felt that punch. I never got anywhere close to tears. And when a movie leans this heavily on effects, it puts the actors in a tough spot. Naomi Watts has the hardest assignment by far. She has to react to fear and gradually relate to a character that wasn't physically present with her in the usual sense. Knowing that makes her work impressive in a technical way. She sells the moment-to-moment reality of it. But even so, her performance can feel repetitive. A lot of wide-eyed wonder, sadness, and half-smiles. Solid, definitely. Iconic? I'm not convinced. Jack Black and Adrien Brody, meanwhile, are mostly along for the ride. Brody doesn't quite fit the role he's given, and Black never fully becomes the bold, larger-than-life showman the story needs him to be. Andy Serkis does what he always does, adds humanity and intention to something that could have been just an effect, but there are limits to what performance capture can express, and this isn't his most powerful work compared to other roles he's done. In the end, I'd still call it a strong blockbuster. Huge scale, big sound, memorable action, and some genuinely impressive set pieces. It's exciting, slick, and easy to watch even years later. I just wish the emotional core was as convincing as the technical craft surrounding it. The movie's ambition is hard to miss. It clearly wants to say something bigger than giant monster causes chaos, and those efforts at weight and meaning are genuinely admirable. The problem is that the deeper touches don't always land as smoothly as some fans insist they do. Even so, it's absolutely worth watching for the pure blockbuster spectacle. Just be prepared for a few creative stumbles and a runtime that can feel a bit heavy. Remakes rarely stand shoulder to shoulder with their originals, let alone outshine them. But Peter Jackson's King Kong comes surprisingly close. It respects the bones of the 1933 classic while dressing it up with modern filmmaking power. Richer detail, bigger emotion, and a wild parade of monstrous threats that feel both terrifying and imaginative. Once the story reaches Skull Island, the film hits the gas and barely lets up. It's a steady stream of high-stakes action and jaw-dropping sequences that practically demand a big screen. What's interesting is how the beginning almost tricks you into thinking you've wandered into a different movie. There's a vivid stretch of 1930s New York that mixes the glamour of Broadway with the harshness of Depression-era struggle. That contrast isn't just atmosphere. It sets the stage for the main characters and makes their choices feel grounded in survival as much as ambition. We meet Indaro, Naomi Watts, as a young actress clinging to hope while the world keeps closing doors in her face, literally, when her show collapses and she's left with nothing. Enter Carl Denham, Jack Black, an upbeat hustler with big dreams and slippery morals. He offers and helps first in the form of food and kindness, and then in the form of an opportunity that's really an invitation into his risky obsession. Black plays Denham with a sharper edge than earlier versions. Less lovable rogue, more showman who bends the truth whenever it suits him. The film also reshapes the male lead dynamic compared to the original. Jack Driscoll, Adrien Brody, is reimagined as a thoughtful writer who's immediately drawn to and giving the story a romantic thread that feels more deliberate than the 1933 film, where Driscoll was simply part of the crew. On top of that, the remake introduces Bruce Baxter, Kyle Chandler, a vain leading man type who's a little too in love with himself. Oddly enough, he works. He adds tension and utility to the Skull Island storyline without completely hijacking the emotional core between and Driscoll. When the ship finally reaches Skull Island, Denham doesn't waste a second. He's already pushing toward shore while Captain Englehorn, Thomas Kretschmann, excellent casting, is still trying to navigate the deadly rocks around the island. The locals are presented as unsettling and fierce, and they feel dangerous in a different way than the creatures that come later. Their fear and worship boil down to one clear name, Kong, and it doesn't take long for it to be singled out as the perfect offering. From that point forward, the film becomes a full-throttle survival ride. One monster sequence slams into the next with barely time to breathe. Kong's first appearance, while powerful, is only the opening note compared to what follows, especially his brutal encounters with multiple T-Rex threats. Where the original relied on stop-motion ingenuity, this version leans into CGI and modern effects to create creatures that feel massive, ugly, and convincingly alive. And in a nod to the classic, one of Kong's finishing moves lands with the same savage intensity that made audiences gasp decades ago. What gives a movie more than just noise and destruction is the way it handles and in Kong. Instead of turning their connection into something awkward or unintentionally ridiculous, as earlier remakes sometimes did, Jackson plays it with a mix of humor, empathy, and cautious trust. When and realizes Kong isn't going to harm her, she begins to communicate in the only way she can, through movement, performance, and playfulness. The scenes where she tries to engage him are surprisingly effective, and Kong's reactions feel disturbingly real. There's a point where you stop thinking of him as an effect and start reading him like a character. A big part of that is the performance work. Kong's expressions and behavior are so detailed that it becomes difficult to separate creature from actor. Andy Serkis' influence is unmistakable, and it adds an emotional believability that could have easily been missing in a movie like this. I also appreciated that Jackson expands on moments the original only hinted at. For example, after the destruction of the log bridge, the film digs further into the consequences of that chaos, echoing a famous deleted concept from the 1933 version that explored what became of those who fell into the abyss. It's the kind of addition that shows real affection for the source material, while still using the remake to build something larger. In the end, this King Kong may not be flawless. Its pacing and length can feel bulky, and its meaningful aspirations don't always click, but as a cinematic event it delivers. If you want massive adventure, relentless danger, and a surprisingly heartfelt bond at the center of the spectacle, it still earns its place as one of the more memorable big-budget remakes. There are a few different stories floating around about why the infamous spider pit moment didn't make it into earlier versions, but this time around there's no mystery. You get the full, gross, nightmare fuel experience. Consider this a friendly warning. If you're squeamish, one particular crew member's exit is going to test both your nerves and your stomach. It's nasty and weirdly inventive. What surprised me is how the movie doesn't rely only on the Skull Island chaos to keep the tension high. Once the story shifts to New York City, the thrills don't drop off at all. One of my favorite touches is the nod to the 1933 classic when Kong is presented to the public. The stage performance by the native dancers mirrors the original in costume and choreography, like a deliberate little time capsule for fans. Kong's New York destruction is staged with real weight and drama, especially the theater escape. Watching him smash through row after row of seats in pure rage is both exciting and kind of terrifying. On the streets, it's exactly what you'd expect. Nothing can stop him at ground level, and cars, trains, and anything else in his way gets flattened like it's made of paper. After the escape hits the headlines and tries to reach him, not with fear, but with empathy, and those scenes help the film feel like more than just a monster rampage. There's a genuinely imaginative moment where Kong discovers ice and snow, and for a second you're allowed to hope the story might somehow turn out differently this time. But the instant those biplanes appear, you can feel the film steering you toward the ending you already know. Still, the finale has an old-school sweep that makes it feel like a tragic legend playing out, not just an action set piece. Kong's last stand is framed as defiance more than defeat, and it's hard not to get caught up in it. Anne's reaction is the emotional anchor, and judging by the muffled sniffles I heard in the theater, I wasn't the only one feeling it. And then Denham seals the moment with his closing line. his famous sentiment about beauty and the beast, bringing things full circle in a way that feels inevitable and heartbreaking. Now, I'll be honest, parts of his King Kong do run long. There are sequences that feel stretched and a few moments that come off like one more spectacle shot rather than story necessity. But even with that, the film is a huge achievement. Jack Black's Carl Denham is especially interesting because he doesn't play like a cartoon villain. He feels like a painfully real kind of person, the obsessed creator who will finish the project no matter the cost, and who mourns lost footage more than lost lives. Later, when Kong becomes a sensation in New York, Denham conveniently downplays how much and Driscoll mattered in capturing him, which fits the character perfectly. The Depression-era framing is another element people will debate. Was it necessary? I think it helps. It gives the characters a believable desperation and makes the trip to Skull Island feel less like a random adventure and more like a gamble they're cornered into taking. And once they're on the island, Jackson goes all in. There's basically a dinosaur chase that plays like an action movie on steroids, and Kong's fight with the T-Rex is staged with the kind of energy that makes you want to cheer even while you're wincing. The scale is massive, the danger feels constant, and the effects work is often jaw-dropping. So yes, I recommend this version. It may not be flawless, and it definitely could have been trimmed down from its nearly 3-hour runtime, but it's still an impressive, high-budget remake that treats the original with respect while going bigger in every direction. Alongside Watts, Brody, and Black, you also get strong supporting turns from Thomas Kretschmann, Colin Hanks, Andy Serkis, and Jamie Bell, plus a mountain of visual effects that still hold up as a showcase of blockbuster craftsmanship. If you love the 1933 film, you'll recognize a lot of this story beat for beat, only now it's delivered with modern scale, heavier emotion, and the kind of spectacle only a director like Peter Jackson would attempt. This film earned major industry recognition. It took home Academy Awards for Best Sound Editing, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Visual Effects, and it also picked up the BAFTA for Best Special Visual Effects. On top of that, it received multiple nominations across production and sound categories, plus Golden Globe nominations, including Best Director and Best Original Score for James Newton Howard. On paper, that's an impressive trophy shelf, and honestly, you can see why in the technical department. Peter Jackson has always had a more is more creative instinct. Early in his career, that approach was part of his charm. Those cult splatter films weren't subtle, but they were wildly committed, and one of them even earned a reputation as one of the goriest movies ever made. The problem is that once Jackson moved fully into big-budget spectacle, that same urge to crank everything to maximum started becoming a liability. His Lord of the Rings trilogy was a massive achievement, no question. But even there, you'd occasionally catch moments where the dial felt turned a bit too far, where the movie didn't just want to wow you, it wanted to keep wowing you until you were worn out. This King Kong remake is where that tendency really tips over the edge. At well over 3 hours, the film feels swollen and overly indulgent. Instead of tightening the story and building momentum, it stretches scenes far beyond their natural endpoint. It also reworks elements of the classic 1933 version in ways that don't improve anything, changing character motivations, inserting extra subplots, and padding the runtime with huge action sequences that feel designed more to show off than to serve the narrative. To be fair, the movie is often stunning to look at. The production design is rich, the environments are detailed, the creature work is accomplished, and the cinematography gives the whole thing a polished, expensive sheen. If you're watching purely for craft, sets, scale, effects, sound, there's plenty to admire. But as storytelling, it's surprisingly shaky. Jackson reportedly wanted to remake King Kong for years, and it shows in a way that isn't always flattering. The script feels like it's carrying every idea that ever made it onto a childhood wish list, whether it belongs in the final movie or not. It borrows the skeleton of the original story, alters details without much benefit, and then piles on extra material until the pacing starts to sag. The character changes are some of the most frustrating. Carl Denham, played by Jack Black, is no longer the bold, capable showman type you can understand following into danger. Here he comes off as more slippery and desperate, the kind of guy you'd avoid at a party rather than gamble your life with. Jack Driscoll, played by Adrien Brody, is also reshaped, less rugged and grounded, more sensitive and writerly, and the shift drains some of the grit from the expedition's dynamic. Meanwhile, Endero is rewritten as a struggling performer whose connection with Kong leans heavily on stage routines and slapstick bits. The movie wants that to be charming, but it lands as awkward and occasionally absurd. And there are new additions that don't help. A young sailor character is introduced who's meant to add heart, but he mostly plays as irritating. And he sticks around long enough that you start wondering why the movie is so determined to keep him safe. Another character is included largely for comic relief, except the humor rarely works, so it becomes more noise in an already overstuffed film. And the new action set pieces, this is where the remake really starts to test patience. There are sequences that feel less like thrilling adventure and more like the movie trying to outdo itself purely for escalation. One extended dinosaur chaos stretch turns into a nonstop gauntlet. Characters sprinting through stampedes, getting swarmed, surviving scenario after scenario that's engineered to keep topping the previous beat. There's also a notorious pit sequence that drags on, plus a big vine and dinosaur battle that plays like a circus act rather than a believable struggle. By the time Kong is involved in yet another oversized spectacle in New York, the film has crossed from exciting into honestly, come on. And that's the core issue. Bigger doesn't automatically mean better. When action becomes that exaggerated and prolonged, it stops generating tension and starts generating irritation, especially in a remake of a story that works best when it's tight, focused, and mythic. I've respected Jackson's work for a long time, and I genuinely think he's a gifted filmmaker. But this movie feels like a case where no one told him that's enough, or worse. Everyone was too impressed by the scale to challenge the excess. The result is a film with undeniable technical achievements, but one that's weighed down by bloated pacing, questionable character rewrites, and action scenes that turn spectacle into self-parody. In short, gorgeous craftsmanship, weak storytelling, and far too much of everything. I hope that his next project, The Lovely Bones, will restore some of my faith in the man's abilities. I'd heard good things about this film, but had been put off by the 3-hour running time. I needn't have worried, though, as it was gripping from start to finish. You certainly need to be in a comfortable chair, though. Naomi Watts was excellent as Endero, an actress who is looking for work in 1933 New York after the theater she works in is closed down. At the same time, director Carl Denham, played by Jack Black, is looking for a new leading lady. They bump into each other, and he talks her into starring in his film, which requires them to travel to a mysterious island. Denham is clearly a bit of a chancer. He has told the cast that they will be filming in Singapore and has set sail just in time to avoid the financial backers who wish to withdraw their backing. When they get to the island, they're confronted by a tribe of savage natives who kill some of them and kidnap Endero and sacrifice her to a giant ape. Of course, the ape does not kill her, but takes her into the jungle. The ship's crew set off after her and have to confront a variety of frightening creatures, including dinosaurs and giant bugs, which kill off a fair number of the crew in some fairly scary ways. Endero manages to charm the giant ape who protects her from the island's other inhabitants. When the crew finally catch up with them, they rescue and capture the ape, which they dub King Kong, and put on display in a New York theater. It escapes and finds and climbs up the Empire State Building for the famous confrontation with military biplanes. The acting is impressive, especially Naomi Watts and Andy Serkis, who did the motion capture work for the giant ape. The chemistry between her and the CGI ape is touching, and all the creatures look believable. I was rather surprised that this had received a 12 certificate, as there are many genuinely frightening scenes that will scare adults, let alone children. Peter Jackson's direction is top-notch. He clearly demonstrates that The Lord of the Rings wasn't a one-off success. Okay. You'd think that so much progress has been made over the approximate 70 years since the original. This remake of the beloved classic King Kong would be superior. But it isn't, just as the recent Spielberg War of the Worlds is inferior to its original. In this King Kong, the basic story is the same as the original. Filmmaker Carl Denham, Jack Black, wants to take a pretty actress, Naomi Watts as Endero, and a crew to remote Skull Island to make an extraordinary film. But he fails to mention all the perils, which include prehistoric monsters and a giant gorilla. This version is full of special effects, CG being used mostly to animate the giant gorilla, the giant beasts, and often the characters themselves. All put together, it adds up to a rather cartoonish treatment of the story. In fact, during the scenes where Darrow, Kong, and the various beasts fall through a webbing of vines in a canyon, I found myself chuckling over the absurdity of the action. Then when the final act of the movie played out in NYC, on Broadway, and onto the Empire State Building, it didn't have the emotional impact that the original did. Lots of action for action junkies, but I never did feel that the whole movie had a connection among its characters. Just lots of fancy movie making which entertained often, but overall was a disappointment for me. Too cartoonish. I won't bother with the story. If you don't know it by now, you have been living in Plato's cave. Kong breaks free of his shackles in a huge New York theater, bursts through the walls, and finds himself in the middle of a busy, nighttime Times Square, crowded with electric lights, cabs, pedestrians, trolleys, and a Pepsi sign. It's the kind of midwinter day where the city feels half frozen and half melted. Dirty snowbanks, slushy gutters, sidewalks that turn into surprise ice rinks. And then Kong shows up and absolutely obliterates the place, which, honestly, is the most fun I had with the movie. I'll admit up front, I didn't watch it in one clean sitting. I caught pieces, scenes here and there, and even in fragments the best moments were still the same. A giant ape turning Manhattan into a demolition exhibit. There's something weirdly therapeutic about watching this huge creature slide around at full speed, carving through Times Square like it owes him money. Taxis get reduced to scrap. Signs and marquees go down like cardboard. Crowds scatter. People get grabbed and tossed aside because, sorry, wrong human. He's looking for, in Darrow, Naomi Watts. The one person the movie insists is his entire emotional universe. And that Times Square, I actually enjoyed seeing it presented as a place with grit and personality, not the polished theme park billboard canyon it eventually became. The movie wants you to marvel at the spectacle, and sure, the spectacle is doing overtime. Everything barrels forward from one familiar beat to the next. Chase, roar, crush, panic, repeat. Kong, at least, moves like he's powered by jet fuel. He's hauling Watts around with one hand while fending off predators with the other, whipping her through the air at speeds that would turn a real person into a cautionary physics lesson. The jungle stretch, though, started to wear me down. After a while, it becomes a non-stop parade of something enormous lunges directly at the camera. Dinosaurs, jaws wide, teeth everywhere, the same visual punctuation mark over and over. One big lunge is exciting. 5 starts to feel like a screensaver. Kong also gets in way too many brawls with way too many creatures, like he's stuck in an endless boss fight gauntlet. If this is his normal afternoon, New York traffic probably feels like a vacation. You can also feel the budget flexing. The movie practically throws money at the screen. Lush detail, constant motion, a lot of look what we could do now. But there's a difference between scale and substance, and the longer it goes, the more it leans on spectacle to compensate for repetition. Then there's the romance problem. The story depends on it, so you can't ignore it. Kong is, there's no delicate way to say this, massive. Naomi Watts is tiny, fragile-looking, like she could crack if you set her down too hard. In a classic setup, he's fascinated by her, drawn to her, protective in this primal, possessive way. But here the movie seems to suggest she's falling for him too. The lingering looks, the soft smiles, the breathy tenderness, the isn't this magical? Energy as they glide together on ice in Central Park like some wildly mismatched dance duo. And that's where my brain starts asking questions the film really doesn't want asked. What exactly is he imagining here? What does she think is happening? It's a 1930s setting. How does this relationship even work outside the dreamlike montage? Is Kong supposed to settle down and get a job? Does he have a resume? Is he applying to med school? Has he finished high school? What's the long-term plan? A tiny apartment? A suburban bungalow? A bed the size of a baseball field? If he rolls over in his sleep, is that just the end of the marriage? And please don't make me think about the logistics of kids. No one involved has thought this through, and the movie coasts on vibes like that's enough. By the time the film circled back for more dinosaur mayhem, I was done. I don't need any more snapping, chomping, man-eating monsters lunging at the audience. I've seen the trick. Let's all agree to retire it for a while. And while we're handing out moratoriums, can we cool it with the King Kong remakes for a bit? They're starting to feel like seasonal releases. New one, shinier effects, same emotional beats, longer runtime. I'm not automatically anti-remake. Sometimes a new version brings real insight, better pacing, sharper character work. Sometimes it even improves the original idea. This one doesn't. Yes, the effects are more advanced than the early classics could dream of, but that's the easiest box to check. Story-wise and character-wise, the older version still wins. Tighter, cleaner, more believable in the ways that matter. This could have been a great modern revisit, something thrilling and memorable. Instead, it goes for the modern default setting. More, louder, longer, bigger set pieces, more creature fights, more everything. Overkill instead of precision. So yeah, Kong smashing up the city? Fantastic. The rest? A bloated march through familiar territory, with too many dinosaurs, too much spectacle, and a central romance that raises questions the movie can't answer. Unless the answer is simply don't think about it. Jackson's King Kong feels like a filmmaker taking a classic and turning every dial past the red line. The action isn't just bigger, it's multiplied. Kong doesn't have a single big showdown. He's thrown into brawls with a whole pack of prehistoric nightmares, sometimes while clinging to rock faces with one hand and keeping it tucked under the other. The danger on the island isn't a quick chase either. At one point it turns into a full-on stampede that practically swallows the visitors. And when the story reaches New York, it isn't one chaotic moment that causes trouble. The city becomes a non-stop demolition reel, with crashes and collisions piling up like the movie refuses to let a street corner survive. It's that constant more approach that starts to wear thin. What should feel intense begins to feel inflated, and the violence stretches on so long and gets so exaggerated that it stops feeling real. There's a point where you're no longer reacting to danger. You're just waiting for the sequence to finally end. Jackson has done this before. When restraint would help, he leans into excess, and the movie risks losing people long before the final scene arrives. The emotional side doesn't always land cleanly either. We're asked to accept that in Darrow, Naomi Watts. Young, charming, and suddenly very adaptable. Moves from terror to comfort with shockingly little transition. This is a creature that should keep her on edge every second. Yet before long, she's performing for him like she's on stage, tossing in playful antics and physical comedy. The rest? A bloated march through familiar territory, with too many dinosaurs, too much spectacle, and a central romance that raises questions the movie can't answer. Unless the answer is simply don't think about it. Jackson's King Kong feels like a filmmaker taking a classic and turning every dial past the red line. The action isn't just bigger, it's multiplied. Kong doesn't have a single big showdown. He's thrown into brawls with a whole pack of prehistoric nightmares, sometimes while clinging to rock faces with one hand and keeping it tucked under the other. The danger on the island isn't a quick chase either. At one point it turns into a full-on stampede that practically swallows the visitors. And when the story reaches New York, it isn't one chaotic moment that causes trouble. The city becomes a non-stop demolition reel, with crashes and collisions piling up like the movie refuses to let a street corner survive. It's that constant more approach that starts to wear thin. What should feel intense begins to feel inflated, and the violence stretches on so long and gets so exaggerated that it stops feeling real. There's a point where you're no longer reacting to danger. You're just waiting for the sequence to finally end. Jackson has done this before. When restraint would help, he leans into excess, and the movie risks losing people long before the final scene arrives. The emotional side doesn't always land cleanly either. We're asked to accept that in Darrow, Naomi Watts. Young, charming, and suddenly very adaptable. Moves from terror to comfort with shockingly little transition. This is a creature that should keep her on edge every second. Yet before long, she's performing for him like she's on stage, tossing in playful antics and physical comedy. By the time the film reaches its closing stretch, the bond turns romantic, and we're left sitting through an extended, misty-eyed Beauty and the Beast stare down that drags past the moment it should have hit and moved on. That's what makes the remake frustrating. Not because it's empty, but because it feels like it could have been tighter, sharper, and more impactful. Compared to the original, and compared to the potential of this story, the final result can feel bloated and strangely numbing. Instead of building to awe, it sometimes overwhelms itself. And yet, it's hard to deny what works. For all the overkill, this is clearly a passion project made on the biggest possible scale. You can feel that Jackson isn't just clocking in. He's swinging for the fences with full resources behind him. Coming off a career-defining triumph, he's essentially been handed the largest canvas imaginable and told to paint whatever he wants. That level of ambition shows. The film is enormous, detailed, and built with the confidence of someone trying to deliver the ultimate version of a straightforward, mythic tale. At its core, the story is still simple. Spectacle wrapped around a tender, tragic relationship, mixed with adventure, humor, and a warning about what happens when ego and curiosity bulldoze into the unknown. Jackson pushes every possibility to the limit, sometimes beyond it, and charges forward as if daring the audience to keep up. The visuals and set pieces have that, how did they even pull this off? Energy, with effects work that fills the world with shadowy danger and pulpy, larger-than-life thrills. Even if you don't love the film, it's tough to write it off as just another brainless action movie. There's craft here, and there's a genuine attempt to balance the wild intensity with something emotional underneath. As a popcorn blockbuster, it absolutely delivers the goods. Huge moments, constant momentum, and a sense of scale that most films can't touch. By the time the film reaches its closing stretch, the bond turns romantic, and we're left sitting through an extended, misty-eyed Beauty and the Beast stare down that drags past the moment it should have hit and moved on. That's what makes the remake frustrating. Not because it's empty, but because it feels like it could have been tighter, sharper, and more impactful. Compared to the original, and compared to the potential of this story, the final result can feel bloated and strangely numbing. Instead of building to awe, it sometimes overwhelms itself. And yet, it's hard to deny what works. For all the overkill, this is clearly a passion project made on the biggest possible scale. You can feel that Jackson isn't just clocking in. He's swinging for the fences with full resources behind him. Coming off a career-defining triumph, he's essentially been handed the largest canvas imaginable and told to paint whatever he wants. That level of ambition shows. The film is enormous, detailed, and built with the confidence of someone trying to deliver the ultimate version of a straightforward, mythic tale. At its core, the story is still simple. Spectacle wrapped around a tender, tragic relationship, mixed with adventure, humor, and a warning about what happens when ego and curiosity bulldoze into the unknown. Jackson pushes every possibility to the limit, sometimes beyond it, and charges forward as if daring the audience to keep up. The visuals and set pieces have that, how did they even pull this off? Energy, with effects work that fills the world with shadowy danger and pulpy, larger-than-life thrills. Even if you don't love the film, it's tough to write it off as just another brainless action movie. There's craft here, and there's a genuine attempt to balance the wild intensity with something emotional underneath. As a popcorn blockbuster, it absolutely delivers the goods. Huge moments, constant momentum, and a sense of scale that most films can't touch. First, you get this fiercely paced brawl where Kong clashes with two dinosaurs, and it keeps escalating, crashing through terrain, tangling into thick jungle spaces, and pushing the action right to the edge of, okay, that's enough, until it sticks the landing with a brutal, crowd-pleasing finish. It's intense without being drenched in gore, but it is rough in a way that might unsettle younger kids. Then, right after that high, the movie swings into something far nastier. A sequence where characters are overwhelmed by giant insects in a scene that's honestly pretty disgusting. It's effective, sure, and it proves Jackson can go full horror when he wants. But it also hints at the film's indulgent side. At times, the movie doesn't just want to entertain you. It wants to overwhelm you. For some people, that's exactly the appeal, and for others, it'll feel like excess. Still, if you're even remotely interested in big-screen spectacle, this is the kind of movie that demands a theater-sized viewing. There's a momentum to it that can be kind of hypnotic. When it's rolling, you stop noticing the mechanics of storytelling and just get pulled along. That it just flows feeling is hard to pull off at this scale, and the film earns points for that alone. If you already know you're not the audience for monster epics, then sure, this might be a catch-it-later situation. But if you want action, atmosphere, and old-school adventure storytelling delivered with modern muscle, it's one of the strongest picks you could make around its release window. It's easy to see why the studio marketed it the way they did. Sweeping filmmaking, a recognizable cast, relentless danger, and effects meant to leave you breathless. And yes, plenty of critics at the time treated it like an event, even a landmark. That said, the visuals are a double-edged sword. The effects work is enormous and often stunning, but can also wear you down. Every so often it feels like the film is showing off simply because it can. There are moments where the punishment the characters take seems impossible to survive, and the sheer length of certain action beats makes you wonder how anyone's still standing afterward. Jackson clearly adores the original story, and he packs in as much as he can, sometimes in ways that enrich the experience, sometimes in ways that make it feel overloaded compared to the tighter simplicity of a 1933 film. One change stands out the most: the emotional angle between and Kong. In earlier versions, that dynamic usually read as fascination, empathy, or a symbolic beauty and the beast idea more than an actual romance. Here, Jackson pushes it further, turning it into something more intimate and more openly framed as a bond with romantic shading. Whether that works will depend on the viewer. Some will find it strangely moving, others will find it a step too far. But either way, it's one of the boldest choices the film makes, and it shapes the entire tone of the story. Their romance plays out like a mutual, wordless ritual, something you can see the moment she performs for him, and later when she nods off in the safety of his hand. With this remake, Peter Jackson goes all in and delivers the most imposing Kong put on screen, sculpted through cutting-edge effects and a production design that's both imaginative and carefully controlled. The screenplay, credited to Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, revisits and retools the foundational premise credited to Edgar Wallace and Marion C. Cooper, while leaving room for the 1933 King Kong, with Fay Wray and Bruce Cabot, to remain the version that lives permanently in movie history. As for the 1976 retread, Jessica Lange, Jeff Bridges, it's the kind of remake that's easier to misplace in your memory than celebrate. Jackson's version, though, aims to be more than a modern copy. It's a huge, lavish spectacle with creature work that's constantly trying to top itself, and sets that feel designed with intention rather than just scale. One notable tweak: this Kong is portrayed more like a massive ape than a classic gorilla-like image, which give him a more versatile physicality. He can lunge, climb, and fight with full-body ferocity. That choice pays off in the extended survival horror set pieces, where he tears through brutal confrontations with dinosaurs, swarms of bat-like predators, and a whole menu of oversized nightmare fuel. At the human center is Naomi Watts as Indaro, and she's the emotional anchor the movie absolutely needs. Her, and isn't just captured, she adapts, observes, and gradually develops a fragile trust with the creature, turning a familiar setup into something strangely tender. Jack Black leans hard into showman mode as filmmaker Carl Denham, a man equal parts hustler and visionary who's determined to unveil the eighth wonder of the world, no matter who gets hurt. Adrien Brody, as Jack Driscoll, is unexpectedly compelling here, reshaped into a struggling playwright rather than the more traditional adventurer type. The supporting cast fills out the expedition with a fun mix of competence and chaos. Colin Hanks plays the loyal assistant Preston. Thomas Kretschmann brings grit as Captain Englehorn, who agrees to ferry Denham's crew to the ominous Skull Island. and Kyle Chandler is nicely cast as the arrogant star Bruce Baxter, obnoxious at first, but capable of surprising courage when it matters. The ensemble is rounded out by faces like Evan Park, Jamie Bell, and Stephen Hall, with Andy Serkis playing a key behind-the-scenes role as well, helping shape Kong's motion-captured movement so the creature feels more alive than animated. If you're watching for standout moments, Jackson gives you more than a few. One of the best is Kong's rampage through New York, an iconic idea staged with extra intensity, especially when he's frantically grabbing at passing blondes as if he's searching for her and in a city that won't stop moving. Just as memorable, in a totally different way, are the quieter jungle beats where Kong interacts with and almost like a curious child with a dangerous amount of strength, playful, awkward, and oddly sweet. The biggest hurdle is the runtime. At over 3 hours, it's undeniably a commitment, and some viewers will feel the film indulges itself with one more creature sequence or one more extended set piece. Still, even when it's a little bloated, it rarely collapses under its own weight. It might be obsessive, but it doesn't feel lifeless, more like a filmmaker refusing to rush a dream project. That context matters too. Jackson has spoken publicly about how the original King Kong made a huge impression on him as a child and planted the seed for his filmmaking ambitions. You can feel that personal attachment in nearly every frame. This isn't a cynical reboot, it's a sincere tribute with blockbuster muscle behind it. For the most part, that homage lands almost entirely. If there's one creative decision that feels harder to defend, it's the depiction of the Skull Island natives, who are presented with an extreme horror makeup approach that borders on dehumanizing. The good news is they don't dominate the film, but the choice sticks out as a rare misstep in an otherwise lovingly crafted remake. In the end, Jackson's King Kong is a grand, effects-driven epic that still manages to find genuine emotion inside the spectacle. It may run long, and it may occasionally overdo the monster mayhem, but when it's working, and it's working most of the time, it feels like an extraordinary modern reimagining of a story that never really stops haunting pop culture. Truthfully, the only real drawback I can point to is the runtime. Even then, that problem flips into a benefit depending on who you are. If you adore the story, have a soft spot for classic King Kong, and have replayed the 1933 version more times than you can count, the extended length can feel like a gift. It gives you a modern companion piece, something newer to revisit now and then. Devotees will always circle back to the Marion C. Cooper/Willis O'Brien landmark, but it's easy to imagine them also returning to this affectionate tribute with a grin, grateful to Peter Jackson for treating the material with such obvious love. In that sense, it's a movie that invites celebration. And it's worth remembering why the original Kong still matters so much. The 1933 film didn't just entertain, it reshaped what audiences believed movies could do. Cinema was still discovering its language, and Kong arrived with innovations in effects, music, and scale that helped push the medium forward. But what often gets overlooked is how bold its storytelling design is. Beneath the monster movie surface, it's also about showmanship and spectacle, about the act of turning danger into entertainment. It plays with the idea that a production meant to be controlled can suddenly become uncontrollable, as if the inner story grows too powerful to stay contained. Jackson clearly understands that legacy and leans into it with intention. This isn't a filmmaker stumbling into a remake. This is someone who's been fascinated by illusion, performance, and self-referential storytelling for a long time. You can feel echoes of his earlier work in the way he stages scenes that comment on filmmaking even while they advance the plot. One smart shift here is how the human romantic lead isn't merely along for the ride. He's tied directly to the shaping of events, as if the film is quietly reminding us that stories don't just happen. Someone is always constructing them. He may think he's observing from the outside, but once the expedition moves, he's dragged into the drama he helped set in motion. That blurring between author and participant, director and victim of the tale, is one of the film's most satisfying undercurrents. Jackson also sprinkles in playful nods that reward attentive viewers. There's a winking awareness of the 1933 production context, including small references to studios and the era's filmmaking machinery. And when the story finally lands in 1930s New York, there's an added layer of delight in how the presentation evokes the earlier film style, suggesting that we're watching a remake that knows it's a remake, while the characters are staging a spectacle that mirrors a spectacle from film history. It's a clever overlap. The narrative is about putting on a show, and the movie itself is another show built on the bones of the first. That idea of the monster crossing the boundary between performance and audience has been revisited countless times in cinema since, but it still feels potent here because Jackson treats it as more than a gimmick. It becomes a way to talk about how stories escape their frames and how spectacle can swallow the people who think they're controlling it. He also folds in broader literary and cinematic echoes. The most obvious parallel is the journey into the unknown, those river into darkness, associations that inevitably call up other famous adventures. Jackson even toys with those references, sometimes playing them straight, and sometimes poking fun at the grand seriousness that often comes with them. But the more intriguing thread is the one that feels Shakespearean in spirit. A layered tale where creation and control, illusion and reality, keep swapping places, like a conjurer calling up storms, setting scenes in motion, and discovering that the emotions unleashed are bigger than the plan. In the end, the movie succeeds because it isn't just trying to be louder or shinier than what came before. It's trying to converse with its source, honoring the original's impact, while adding its own reflections on storytelling, spectacle, and the thin line between staging danger and being consumed by it. The length may test some viewers, but for fans of Kong's history and mythology, it's the kind of indulgence that feels earned. Peter Jackson's King Kong, 2005, is a blockbuster with the soul of a film nerd's love letter. It doesn't just remake the 1933 classic. It argues with it, mirrors it, and occasionally tries to outmyth it. The result is a film that's often breathtaking, sometimes indulgent, and, when it's firing on all cylinders, flat-out monumental. The basic engine is familiar. A desperate crew sails to the rumored Skull Island, discovers a world that time forgot, captures a towering ape, and drags him back to civilization for profit. You already know how that ends. What's interesting is how Jackson treats that outline less like a plot and more like a framework for exploring spectacle, romance, and the machinery of storytelling itself. One of the movie's smartest undercurrents is how it stacks performances inside performances. You're not only watching a film, you're watching characters making a film, selling a show, and performing versions of themselves for different audiences. That layered structure creates a strange echo. The inner acts, the staged entertainment, the scripted bits, the public exhibition, reflect the outer film, and the outer film reflects them right back. It's like Jackson is constantly reminding you that Kong isn't just a creature. He's also a projection screen for everyone's fantasies, Denham's ambition, the crowd's appetite, and N's complicated empathy. Even the movie's scale plays into that idea. Physical size becomes emotional distance. Humans dwarfed by cliffs, beasts, and temples. Then later, Kong dwarfed by a city that turns him into a product. Skull Island is shot like a fever dream of vertical space. Bridges, pits, vines, precipices, so the action feels staged in multiple planes at once. Jackson's best sequences don't just move forward. They move through space, with the camera swooping, dropping, and sliding as if gravity is optional. If you want the pure proof of why this film still matters, it's in the action set pieces where Jackson turns chaos into choreography. The standout is the extended struggle where bodies and vines and momentum all become part of the fight's geometry. An aerial brawl that makes you feel like you're inside a moving ride, except the ride is trying to kill you. Later, the final aerial pursuit delivers angles and motion that still feel unusually bold for a mainstream studio climax, as though Jackson is determined to show you a new way to stage big action. And yet, the movie is also too much movie. Jackson aims for operatic emotion, but the first hour can feel like the film clearing its throat, repeating character beats, leaning on-the-nose dialogue, and padding the runway for a takeoff that takes a while to arrive. Once the story reaches Skull Island, the craft and atmosphere surge. But getting there can test your patience even when you like the film. The visual effects are mostly impressive, especially in Kong's expressive performance. There's real character work in how he moves and reacts, but not every effects-heavy moment holds up equally well. One major stampede sequence, in particular, has a weightless quality, less terrifying force of nature, and more digital crowd simulation. And the interaction between actors and CGI can look oddly separated. It's a rare spot where the budget shows because it doesn't quite show enough reality. What really sells the whole enterprise, though, is the film's central relationship. Jackson leans into the beauty and the beast grammar, fear giving way to curiosity, curiosity turning into intimacy, intimacy turning into tragedy. It's surprisingly tender, and it's also carefully abstracted. The romance is communicated through glances, proximity, and small gestures rather than anything literal. Some viewers may wish the film pushed further into raw, bodily humanity the way older monster movies sometimes dare to do. The uncomfortable, animal, intimate details that make the fantasy sting. Jackson stays cleaner, more marketable, and arguably less primal. The trade-off is tonal consistency. The cost is a bit of that unsettling human edge. Rewatching it now, especially after Kong, Skull Island, 2017, the difference in ambition is hard to miss. The 2017 film is a knowingly pulpy action ride, efficient and loud. Jackson's version wants to be mythic, romantic, self-aware, and tragic all at once. Sometimes that reach makes it sag. Sometimes it makes it soar. For all its bloat, when King Kong 2005 hits its stride, it delivers the rare blockbuster feeling of watching a filmmaker swing for something enormous and land enough of it to make the effort unforgettable. It's messy, it's grand, it's occasionally frustrating, but in its best moments, it's the kind of spectacle that resets your sense of what action and scale can look like. Peter Jackson's King Kong 2005 feels like the inevitable follow-up to The Lord of the Rings, a director riding the momentum of a massive triumph and being handed the keys to whatever passion project he wanted next. After a trilogy that dominated the culture and rewired what blockbusters could look like, the idea of Jackson tackling Kong probably seemed like a sure thing from the moment Return of the King took its final bow. And in flashes, it absolutely is a sure thing. When the film commits to spectacle, it's a full-throttle ride. The action doesn't just function, it crackles. The creature clashes are the big selling point, and the movie delivers those with real energy. But what surprised me most isn't the chaos, it's the quiet. On Skull Island, when the noise fades and the film lets Kong and Ndero simply exist in the same space, it finds a strange tenderness. Those calm stretches, two unlikely companions taking in a world everyone else wants to exploit, land with more emotional weight than you'd expect from a mega-budget monster movie. Then the story pivots back to civilization, and the film becomes a runaway train. Mayhem, crowds, destruction, and finally a last act that's staged with a kind of old-school grandeur. The period detail is gorgeous, right up until it gets smashed to pieces in the man versus beast showdown. Even now, despite knowing where it's headed, I'm still emotionally siding with the giant. That Beauty and the Beast core is the film's beating heart, and when it's allowed to breathe, it's genuinely moving. The frustration is that Jackson doesn't always know when to stop. The movie's biggest issue isn't that it's bad, it's that it's often too much. There's a sense of excess that creeps in over the runtime, like the director is so in love with the world and the tools at his disposal that no one was willing to say, this part doesn't need to be here. The cast is game, and the performance work behind Kong is a standout. The creature isn't just an effect, he's a character. At its best, the film is thrilling and surprisingly heartfelt, the kind of big-screen entertainment that really shines in high definition. But it keeps drifting into indulgence, and that softens the impact. Compared to The Lord of the Rings, the difference is noticeable. LOTR could be massive and still feel grounded. Real landscapes, real texture, a sense of weight and presence even when the fantasy went big. Here, Skull Island sometimes carries that built feeling like you can sense the stage beneath the jungle. The creature clashes are the big selling point, and the movie delivers those with real energy. But what surprised me most isn't the chaos, it's the quiet. On Skull Island, when the noise fades and the film lets Kong and Indaro simply exist in the same space, it finds a strange tenderness. Those calm stretches, two unlikely companions taking in a world everyone else wants to exploit, land with more emotional weight than you'd expect from a mega-budget monster movie. Then the story pivots back to civilization, and the film becomes a runaway train. Mayhem, crowds, destruction, and finally a last act that's staged with a kind of old-school grandeur. The period detail is gorgeous, right up until it gets smashed to pieces in the man versus beast showdown. Even now, despite knowing where it's headed, I'm still emotionally siding with the giant. That Beauty and the Beast core is the film's beating heart, and when it's allowed to breathe, it's genuinely moving. The frustration is that Jackson doesn't always know when to stop. The movie's biggest issue isn't that it's bad, it's that it's often too much. There's a sense of excess that creeps in over the runtime, like the director is so in love with the world and the tools at his disposal that no one was willing to say, this part doesn't need to be here. The cast is game, and the performance work behind Kong is a standout. The creature isn't just an effect, he's a character. At its best, the film is thrilling and surprisingly heartfelt, the kind of big-screen entertainment that really shines in high definition. But it keeps drifting into indulgence, and that softens the impact. Compared to The Lord of the Rings, the difference is noticeable. LOTR could be massive and still feel grounded. Real landscapes, real texture, a sense of weight and presence, even when the fantasy went big. Here, Skull Island sometimes carries that built feeling like you can sense the stage beneath the jungle. And, to a certain extent, they pull it off. This is a remake that treats the source with respect, avoids the sillier impulses associated with the 76 reinterpretation, and leans into modern CGI not just for spectacle, but to make Kong finally feel like what he always should have been, a believable, powerful gorilla, not a half-human creature in an ape costume. Even though Kong is the very reason this film exists, Jackson delays the big entrance. More than 40 minutes pass before the locals' tour Kong steps into the story. That time isn't wasted. It's used to set a world and shape motivations, making the adventure feel earned rather than rushed. With the depression firmly in the background, the script gives real weight to the desperation of Indaro, a performer clinging to survival, and to her longing for the stage, here tied closely to Jack Driscoll, reimagined from a simpler role in the original into something more central. On the other side stands Carl Denham, a man driven less by morality than by hunger, ambition, relevance, legacy, whatever you want to call that last, frantic push to prove he still matters. The emotional wiring of the film depends on that triangle, and it mostly works, and, especially, is given an arc that keeps growing as the story unfolds. She isn't treated as a passive prize. She develops, reacts, adapts, and becomes the emotional anchor of the journey. Almost the reverse of how the 1976 remake handled its heroine. That grounding is a big reason the movie stays engaging even with its extended runtime. For all its length, it has a strong, one-more-scene momentum that makes it hard to look away. From the opening, the film shows off its craft. New York in the 1930s is recreated with obsessive detail, misery and struggle spilling from parks to theater blocks, poverty sitting right beside glamour. The costumes and production design sell the era immediately, and the color palette does something smart. It nods to the classic films of the time, while still allowing a kind of soft brightness, as if the movie is insisting that hope can exist even when the world is falling apart. It's an idealized version of history, sure, but deliberately so, because the film understands how entertainment once functioned as relief, a temporary escape for people living through constant hardship. The first act also leans into recognizable character shapes, and, as the generous, wide-eyed survivor, Denham as the charming opportunist who'll cross lines if it gets him a masterpiece. But the writing keeps them lively enough that they don't feel like cardboard. The cast helps too. Everyone looks settled into their roles, even if it takes a moment to adjust to Jack Black, playing someone who often hovers between amusing, slimy, and unsettling. Naomi Watts is the film's secret weapon. She has a classic screen presence that makes her feel like she belongs to that era, blonde, luminous, expressive, and she uses it without slipping into parody. Her and Carrie's both vulnerability and grit, and the film benefits every time the camera simply lets her react. Inn's decision to join the project is also given a stronger hook here. She signs on only after learning that the writer is Jack Driscoll, played by Adrien Brody, fresh off The Pianist, a detail that frames the voyage as more than just a job. It becomes a chance at meaning, even connection. Once the crew boards the SS Venture and heads toward the southern seas, the movie shifts gears into pure adventure. But because the film spent time building its people and its world first, the spectacle lands with more force. When Skull Island finally arrives, along with its creatures, its danger, and the looming presence of Kong, the movie isn't just trying to impress your eyes. It's trying to make you feel the thrill the original once delivered, the sense that you've stepped into a myth that somehow looks real. While the crew is still at sea, romance unexpectedly enters the picture. During the shipbound portion of the story, sparks fly between the lead actress and the screenwriter. Peter Jackson takes his time here, and that patience is deliberate. He doesn't hurry through introductions or force emotional beats. Instead, he lays out personalities, motivations, and tensions at an unhurried pace, setup that pays off once the narrative pivots into its more intense second act on Skull Island. The casting helps anchor this slow burn opening. The captain of the Venture, an experienced commander who roams the world capturing rare creatures for zoos and other far less respectable buyers, is played by German actor Thomas Kretschmann, who gives the role weight and authority. Colin Hanks plays Preston, Carl Denham's assistant, and the closest thing the production has to a moral compass. Jamie Bell appears as Jimmy, the young sailor with a rough background who sees the voyage as his ticket to something bigger than survival. Evan Parks Hayes brings additional texture, a veteran of the 369th Division of the 24th Infantry, representing one of the earliest black units to serve in World War I. And then there's Bruce Baxter, the smug, hot-headed B-movie performer, played by Kyle Chandler, who feels like a deliberate nod to the old Hollywood archetypes tied to earlier versions of the Kong mythos. Once the film shifts gears, it rarely slows down. From that point forward, whether the characters are in the water, trekking through the jungle, or hanging on for dear life at impossible heights, the momentum stays high. When a story leaves New York behind and enters Skull Island, the film fully embraces blockbuster showmanship. Even so, the early Skull Island stretch doesn't feel like empty noise. The ship's approach through thick fog and the uneasy encounter with the island's inhabitants, leading to Anne's abduction, contains sequences that wouldn't look out of place in top-tier modern horror. The tension is palpable, and Jackson uses the camera as a tool of misdirection. Quick, disorienting movements, sudden reframing, and even moments where the image feels intentionally obscured to keep the audience off balance. After Anne is taken and Kong enters the center of the story, the movie becomes a full-throttle adventure. Jackson leans heavily into ambitious action set pieces, unleashing a barrage of clashes. Humans against beasts, beasts against beasts, and even humans versus swarming nightmares from the insect world. The sequences chain together with barely a pause, carrying the viewer forward until the inevitable moment when a mighty creature is finally captured. Visually, not every digital element is flawless. One clear example is the stampede of brontosaurs. At points, the animals look a bit too manufactured, with textures that feel flatter than they should and motion that occasionally betrays the computer-generated construction. But the film largely wins back any lost realism the moment Kong takes focus. This version of the giant ape isn't just impressive in size and detail. He's emotionally readable. The playful curiosity he shows toward and the sudden rage when others threaten their fragile connection, and the intensity with which he protects her give him a surprising inner life. That emotional impact owes a lot to Andy Serkis. Much like his landmark performance work as Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, Serkis uses motion capture to provide more than movement. He supplies character. Through performance and physical nuance, he helps turn Kong into something more than a digital creature, adding humanity that earlier incarnations, from a 1933 effects to the 1976 suit, couldn't quite achieve in the same way. As a fun extra, Serkis also appears on-screen as the Venture's cook, a small-in-the-flesh reward after the heavy lifting of bringing Kong to life. The film's relentless midsection could have tipped into excess if it weren't for the moments where it allows the story to breathe, especially the standout sequence where the usual roles flip and performs for Kong. That scene matters because it builds the bond between them. Without it, all the spectacle might feel like spectacle for its own sake, no matter how technically impressive the visuals are. Thankfully, the final act in New York restores the classic balance between emotion and scale. And the music deserves special mention. James Newton Howard's score carries the film through wonder, dread, romance, and action with remarkable control, often elevating scenes beyond what the images alone might achieve. By the end, it's hard not to feel that the original creators, Marion C. Cooper and co-director Ernest B. Skudsack, would recognize their iconic imagery echoed here, particularly the enduring idea of Kong as both terrifying force and tragic figure. Not everyone will love the result, and it's fair to point out that the script isn't airtight. There are a few noticeable gaps and convenient turns along the way. Still, as a grand-scale reinterpretation that mixes old-school adventure with modern filmmaking, it's a version with real ambition and a surprising amount of heart. You'd expect that after pulling off something as massive as The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson would be the safest pair of hands imaginable for a modern King Kong. On paper, it's a perfect match. A director known for huge-scale adventure, emotion-driven spectacle, and technical ambition taking on one of cinema's most famous creature stories. And in fairness, a lot of what Jackson delivers is exactly that. Grand, energetic, and often impressive. He clearly loves the original, and the film carries that classic Hollywood adventure spirit, with romance and tragedy baked into the monster movie framework. At its best, it feels like a respectful salute to the 1933 version while still being unmistakably a Peter Jackson production. That said, the movie also becomes an easy target for a specific kind of criticism. It's big, sometimes for the sake of being big. The length problem, the most common complaint, isn't the acting or even the premise. It's the runtime. This is a film that stretches to roughly 3 hours, and you feel that weight. Some epics justify long runtimes because the story is stacked with events and world building. With King Kong, the narrative isn't actually that complicated, so the extended duration can feel like extra padding rather than essential storytelling. You can almost see the intention. Jackson wants the film to be a full banquet, not a quick meal. He adds detours, extended set pieces, and additional characters, so the movie feels like a blockbuster event. Whether you love or hate that approach depends on your patience for spectacle. Questions the film doesn't fully answer, even when you accept adventure logic. The movie still leaves you squinting at certain choices. For instance, what becomes of the people living on Skull Island after all this chaos? How exactly did the crew manage the logistics of bringing certain props and wardrobe items all the way back to New York? And why does the story lean on essentially the same rescue device more than once? Using another last-second here comes help moment to keep the leads alive. In the original era, audiences were more willing to roll with these gaps because the thrill of the concept did most of the heavy lifting. Modern viewers, however, tend to notice those seams. And the biggest unanswered practical issue remains the same old elephant in the room: transporting Kong. The movie wants you to accept that the giant creature can be captured, restrained, loaded, shipped, and unveiled like a circus attraction, without spending enough time making that feel believable. You either buy it because you want to, or it nags at you the whole way. The story we know, expanded the skeleton of the plot, is still the familiar one. A crew sails out to a mysterious island, encounters a dangerous culture with rituals, and a young woman becomes the center of a terrifying offering to something colossal. The heroes chase after her into the island's nightmare interior, facing creatures and hazards as the scale escalates. It's classic pulp adventure, simple, direct, and designed for thrills. The problem is that the remake sometimes adds so much along the way that the straightforward story starts to sag under extra weight. More characters, more subplots, more extended action beats. Eventually, the pacing starts working against the tension. The spectacle versus the story. Jackson's ambition is obvious. He wants to outdo what came before, and in many sequences the production is undeniably huge. The film swings for awe, fear, and wonder all at once. But it's also where reactions split. Some viewers see it as a technical flex and an emotional monster tragedy with real heart. Others feel the film is trying too hard to prove itself, so focused on topping previous effects and set pieces that it forgets to move efficiently. Final take: in the end, Jackson's King Kong is both a tribute and an overreach. It's a filmmaker showing love for a classic while also getting carried away by his own toolbox. You could call it a flawed achievement, messy, overlong, and occasionally questionable in logic, but also packed with ambition and moments of real cinematic power. If you watch it in the right mood, ready for a long, old-school adventure with modern-scale spectacle, it can feel like time well spent. If you're expecting tight pacing and clean storytelling, the runtime and extra material may test your patience. Either way, it's hard to deny this. Jackson made a huge version of King Kong, sometimes wonderfully huge, sometimes unnecessarily huge, and that's exactly what defines the film. Not only do the performers often look like they've been pasted into the frame, but the movie keeps reminding you how artificial it is. You can practically see the scenes where the actors meet the effects. Charging dinosaurs, epic backdrops, and those so-called lush environments that sometimes resemble bargain art projects, flat, washed out, and oddly generic. For all its flaws, John Guillermin's 1976 King Kong, with Jeff Bridges and the breakout Jessica Lange, at least feels sturdier and more watchable than this overgrown redo. Honestly, even the knowingly silly Japanese entries, King Kong vs. Godzilla, 1962-63, depending on release, and King Kong Escapes, 1967, come off as more fun simply because they don't pretend to be profound while dragging you through 3 hours of noise. It's also a little wild that the film landed a PG-13 considering how nasty it gets. Sure, teenage boys will always cheer for prehistoric creatures beating each other up, but there are moments here that lean hard into gross-out horror. There's a sequence crawling with skittering bugs that feels engineered to make you itch in your seat. And then there's the low point, a drawn-out attack involving massive worm-like monsters that's staged with a level of graphic nastiness the earlier films never needed. One of them latches onto a man's head, and the camera lingers long enough to make the whole thing feel less like adventure and more like a dare. The original King Kong didn't require that kind of queasy spectacle, and neither did the later modern remakes and sequels. That's the larger problem. The screenplay seems determined to improve what never required improvement. It breaks the basic remake rule. If the core works, don't overhaul it just to prove you can. Here, the film reshapes Jack Driscoll into a different sort of character entirely, swaps straightforward adventure momentum for added baggage, and stuffs the ship with extra faces who exist mostly to fill minutes. A couple of side threads feel like they're trying to create depth, but they land as detours. Even the new celebrity character and the retooling of the island's inhabitants push the movie into grim fantasy territory. Less classic pulp myth, more look how intense we can be. The natives, in particular, are presented as grotesque nightmare figures, as if the movie is borrowing a darker aesthetic from Jackson's earlier fantasy work and pasting it onto a story that doesn't benefit from it. Skull Island itself is no longer mysterious in a dreamy way. It's aggressively stylized. The geography looks like a feverish comic panel, looming rock formations that feel designed rather than discovered, and a landscape littered with remains like a visual shorthand for this place is cursed. Jackson shoots much of it in a jittery, quasi-documentary manner that seems meant to make the ugliness feel raw, but it often has the opposite effect. The more the film insists on its realism, the faker the sets and digital extensions can look. Even the big dividing wall that's supposed to be imposing comes across like a flimsy prop, more theme park texture than ancient monument. Naomi Watts steps into the Andero role, immortalized by Fay Wray, and her interpretation aims for uncertainty and compassion. This and can't quite decide whether she's terrified of Kong, saddened by him, or both. The film leans into that ambiguity, including moments where she tries to entertain him, little vaudeville bits meant to humanize their connection. Those scenes are among the few that gesture toward wonder, but they're fighting an uphill battle against the movie's obsession with chaos. And that's why the final act, no matter how iconic the setting, isn't enough. The skyscraper climax is still the image, but here it feels like a checkpoint rather than an emotional payoff. The 1933 film, despite its now primitive technique, was genuinely enchanting for audiences of its era because it delivered something uncanny and new. A strange, sad fairy tale wrapped in spectacle. This version is louder, longer, and far more fixated on destruction than discovery. Even the dinosaur sequences, meant to be showstoppers, struggle in the shadow of the Jurassic Park films, which handle suspense, awe, and clarity with far more precision. So, yes, on paper it's the same premise. A remake of the 1933 classic about a giant ape and the woman who changes him. And I'll admit it up front, I've enjoyed pretty much everything Peter Jackson has made, until this. Every filmmaker swings and misses sometimes. Even legends have their misfires. But this one feels like a miss that keeps doubling down. If you want a story to work, you're better off with the eerie charm of the black and white original or even the glossy, goofier 1976 take. This remake is bloated, self-important, and strangely joyless. An overhyped endurance test with a mayhem replaces the magic. In my opinion, this is the first time Peter Jackson made a film that genuinely doesn't work. Right from the start, I kept asking myself, why remake this at all? The 1933 King Kong is already a classic that holds up surprisingly well. So redoing it feels unnecessary unless you're bringing something truly new to the table. The biggest issue is the runtime. This movie is way too long. It pushes close to 3 hours, and it absolutely didn't need to. With some serious trimming, it could have been tighter, sharper, and far more exciting. The opening stretch spends a lot of time setting up the characters, and normally I like slow build-up, but here, I just didn't connect with them. The dialogue often feels exaggerated and unnatural, like it came straight out of a comic book. People don't talk like that, and it pulled me out of the story more than once. There's also a frustrating subplot tease involving the character played by Jamie Bell. The film hints at a mystery about him, like it's going somewhere important, and then it just drops it completely. It's like the script remembered it was supposed to matter, and then forgot. And surprisingly, the lead performances didn't help. Naomi Watts and Jack Black feel stuck in one mode the whole time, and Adrien Brody looks like he's going through the motions. I get it. Actors often have to react to things that aren't really there during effects-heavy scenes. But even in quieter moments, they don't bring much life to the characters. That said, once the story reaches Skull Island, the movie does pick up. The action becomes intense, the visuals are impressive, and there are some genuinely thrilling sequences. But a lot of the creature encounters felt familiar, like variations of things we've already seen in Jurassic Park and similar adventure films. The spectacle is big, no doubt, but not always fresh. To me, the film breaks into 3 big sections. The first hour is essentially New York setup, and while it's slow, I'll give it credit. The Depression-era atmosphere is beautifully done. The city feels alive, and the period detail is excellent. The second section is the island survival stretch, packed with non-stop attacks from dinosaurs, giant insects, and other nightmares. The problem is that it goes on too long. There's a point where the movie starts piling on one creature fight after another, and instead of getting more exciting, it starts feeling repetitive. Some moments, like the characters mowing down oversized bugs, cross into this is kind of ridiculous territory and stretch believability past its limit. Then the third section returns to New York, and for a while it actually feels a bit flat again, until Kong breaks loose. Once that happens, the movie finally finds a stronger rhythm. The Empire State Building sequence is filmed with real skill, and the height and vertigo are captured so well that I honestly felt tense watching it. The swooping camera angles, the city spinning beneath, the planes circling, those moments are staged to make you feel the danger. But even there, the movie overdoes it. The final showdown goes on too long. Eventually, I stopped feeling emotional and started thinking, okay, we get it. It reached the point where I was just waiting for it to end. And there are a few logic gaps that bug me, like the huge one. How exactly did they transport Kong from the island to New York on a ship? The film doesn't really explain it, and for something that massive, it's a strange detail to gloss over. The music also didn't leave much of an impression on me. A lot of the score blends together and feels repetitive. One more thing, some scenes are pretty harsh for younger kids. The violence and intensity go further than what many families might expect from a big Hollywood adventure remake. To be fair, the movie does get several things right.